Mark Ramsey looked out of the window of his office in Seattle. He could see the rain-speckled glass and the blur of the city skyline. He was 35 and had a great job as a project manager at a successful tech company. He was married to Amanda, who was a marketing executive for a well-known fashion brand. He'd been with the same fashion brand for 5 years. No kids, but it seemed like their life was full of joy and comfort. He glanced at the framed photo on his desk of him and Amanda at their favorite restaurant, both smiling widely. It had been taken just last month during one of their regular nights out. The routine they'd settled into felt comfortable and predictable in the best way. His phone buzzed with a text from Amanda. "Don't forget we're trying that new Italian place tonight. Can't wait to see you. Love you, Mark." He smiled, warmth spreading through. Even after 5 years, Amanda still made him feel like the luckiest man alive. He quickly typed back, "I wouldn't miss it for the world. Love you too." He then turned back to his computer and started looking at project reports. Mark couldn't help but feel content. He was determined to climb the corporate ladder to provide the best life possible for him and Amanda. The long hours were worth it. He told himself that because it was all for their future. Later that evening, as they sat across from each other at the restaurant, candlelight flickering between them, Mark reached out and took Amanda's hand. He said, raising his wine glass with his free hand. Amanda's smile was radiant as she clinked her glass against his. They toasted to many more years of happiness as they talked and laughed over dinner. They shared stories about their day and made plans for their upcoming weekend getaway. Mark felt a deep sense of gratitude. This was what he worked so hard for. These moments of connection. They seemed to have it all. A perfect life. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. Months later, Mark found himself working late into the night again. The office was quiet, most of his colleagues having left hours ago. But he barely noticed the passage of time, engrossed in preparing for a critical client presentation the next day. His phone buzzed with a text from Amanda, another late night. Mark glanced at the clock, wincing when he saw it was past 10 p.m. He quickly replied, "Sorry, big presentation tomorrow, don't wait up." There was a long pause before Amanda replied. One letter spoke volumes. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew Amanda was frustrated with his long hours, but he was close to landing a major account. If he could just push through for a few more weeks, as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the distance between Mark and Amanda grew. Their once lively dinner conversations dwindled into silence. Getaways became a thing of the past, replaced by Mark's constant need to catch up on work. Amanda, who was once so communicative and affectionate, had become cold and distant. Mark couldn't remember the last time they'd been intimate. It had been 6 months, maybe longer. He told himself it was just stress, that things would get better once this big project was over. One night Mark came home late as usual, expecting to find Amanda already asleep. Instead, he found her sitting in the dark living room, illuminated only by the glow of her phone. "Hey," he said. He put his briefcase down carefully. "Everything okay?" he asked. Amanda looked up at him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "Just working late," she said, her voice flat. Mark could respond, but she stood up and brushed past him, heading for their bedroom. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Mark alone in the darkened room. He sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. When had things gotten so bad between them? He couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing Amanda, but he didn't know how to fix it. Work had become a constant presence in his life, a source of validation. How could he step back now, when he was so close to achieving everything he'd worked for? As he sat there in the quiet house, Mark made a silent promise to himself. Once this big project was over, he'd make things right with Amanda. They'd go on a vacation, reconnect, rebuild what they'd lost. He just needed a little more time, but time was not on his side. It was a quiet Tuesday night. Mark had fallen into an exhausted sleep around 10 p.m. His mind was still on work. Amanda had texted earlier to say she was working late, which had become pretty common over the past few months. Mark hadn't thought much of it, too tired to notice the growing disconnect between them. Then the shrill ring of his phone shattered the silence, jolting Mark from his fitful sleep. He fumbled for the device, squinting at it. The bright screen showed an unknown number, and Mark was still half asleep. He answered, "Hello, Mr. Ramsey." A deep, authoritative voice came through the line. "This is Officer Johnson with the Seattle Police Department. With unspoken tension, Mr. Ramsey, I'm sorry to inform you that your wife, Amanda Ramsey, has been arrested for solicitation." Mark blinked. He had misheard solicitation. "I don't understand," he said. "There must be some mistake." "I'm afraid not," Officer Johnson replied. His tone was sympathetic but firm. "Your wife was caught in a sting operation attempting to engage in prostitution." The room seemed to spin. Mark gripped the edge of the bed, struggling to process what he was hearing. Amanda. His Amanda. The woman he built a life with, who he thought he knew better than anyone in the world. This can't be right," Mark stammered. "Where is she? Is she okay?" "She's currently being held at the downtown precinct." Precinct Officer Johnson told him she wasn't hurt but was understandably upset. He could come down to the station to see her and talk about bail options. Mark's mind was racing. How could his life have unraveled so completely in a single phone call? He managed to say he'd be right there, his voice barely above a whisper as he hung up. Up the phone, Mark sat motionless on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the wall. The life he thought he knew, the marriage he believed in, had just been shattered into a million pieces. With a shaking hand, he began to dress as he moved through the motions. His mind was flooded with questions. How long had this been going on? Why would Amanda do this? Was their entire marriage a lie? The drive to the police station was a blur. Mark gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He kept expecting to wake up to find that this was all a twisted nightmare. But as he pulled into the parking lot of the precinct, the harsh reality of the situation began to sink in. His wife, the woman he'd promised to love and cherish for the rest of his life, had been arrested for prostitution. The foundation of trust their marriage had been built on was crumbling beneath his feet. In its place, a chasm of betrayal and lies yawned wide. Mark walked into the station, his mind spinning with unanswered questions and a growing sense of anger. Mark was forced to come face to face with a side of Amanda he never knew existed, and nothing would ever be the same again. Each step he took in the sterile hallway of the police station felt like a mile, and his mind was still reeling from the phone call that had shattered his world. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to mock the darkness creeping into his heart. Mock the darkness creeping into his heart, Officer Johnson led him to a small room. His hand hesitated on the doorknob. "She's in here, Mr. Ramsey. Take as much time as you need." The door creaked open, revealing a sight that made Mark's stomach lurch. Amanda sat hunched at a metal table. Her wrists were bound by cold steel. Her mascara had left dark trails down her cheeks. Her cheeks were flushed, and her hair was a disheveled mess. She looked small and vulnerable, unlike the confident woman he thought he knew. Neither of them spoke for a moment, the air thick with tension. Mark's mind was racing with questions, but when he finally opened his mouth, only one came out. "Why?" Amanda flinched at the raw pain in his voice. She kept her eyes fixed on the table, unable to meet his gaze. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I've been seeing other men. I've been doing this for months." The words hit Mark like a physical blow. He staggered back, gripping the edge of the table to steady himself. Reality seemed to tilt on its axis, warping around him. He repeated disbelief, his tone colored with months of anger and hurt. "Why would you do this?" His voice broke, warning for dominance. Amanda's shoulders hunched further, as if trying to make herself as small as possible. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red-rimmed and she said, her voice gaining strength, "I wasn't happy, Mark. You're never home. We haven't touched each other in months. You shut me out and I felt so lonely." Her voice cracked, but she pushed on. "When I met those men, it was the only time I felt alive again." Mark recoiled as if she'd slapped him. "So you threw away our—" Amanda's eyes flashed with a spark of the woman he'd used. She replied, her words cutting deep. She said she needed something he couldn't give her anymore. She said she didn't care if she had to go to the streets. She felt it seemed that strangers were more interested in her than he was. Mark stared at her, unable to reconcile this bitter, angry woman with the loving wife he thought he knew. He asked, his voice hollow, how long she had been doing this. Amanda looked away, shame coloring her cheeks. She admitted, quietly at first, that it had been 6 months. It had started as just flirting and harmless attention, but it had quickly escalated. Mark's mind reeled, unable to process the revelation. 6 months, or half a year, of lies and betrayal. Every late night at the office, every text message he hadn't questioned at all took on a sinister new meaning. "Who else knows?" he demanded, suddenly terrified of the scandal that could be brewing. Amanda shook her head. "No one. I was careful, or I thought I was." She laughed bitterly. "Guess I wasn't careful enough." Mark paced the small room, running his hands through his hair. His world was crumbling around him, and he had no idea how to stop it. "What happens now?" he asked. More to himself than Amanda looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "I don't know," she admitted. "But Mark, please, I need your help. I can't go to jail, it would ruin everything." Mark was tempted. The instinct to protect her, ingrained over years of marriage, reared its head. But then he remembered the cold calculation in her voice when she spoke of feeling desired by strangers. The woman he loved was gone, replaced by someone he didn't recognize. "You should have thought of that before you decided to. Sell yourself on the streets," he said, his voice cold. "You made your choices, Amanda. Now you get to live with the consequences." He turned to leave, unable to look at her any longer as his hand touched the doorknob. Amanda's voice stopped him. "Mark," she called, desperation clear in her tone. "Please, I love you, we can fix this." He paused, considering her words. Then, without turning around, he spoke. "No, Amanda. Some things, once broken, can't be put back together." He walked out, leaving. As the door closed behind him, Mark felt a strange sense of finality. The life he had known was over. He had no idea what would come next. A week after that fateful night at the police station, Mark found himself sitting in a stark office, staring at a stack of papers that would end his marriage. The divorce attorney across from him spoke in a low, sympathetic tone, but Mark barely heard the words. His mind was still reeling from the events of the past. Over the next week, Mark moved out of their shared apartment. He couldn't face the memories that haunted every corner of the small loft he'd rented closer to his office. It felt empty and impersonal, a fitting reflection of the hollow in his chest. Mark signed page after page mechanically, without really seeing what he was signing. His mind kept drifting back to happy moments he and Amanda had shared. There was the sunny afternoon he proposed in the park, their wedding day, and her smile as she walked down the aisle. He also thought about lazy Sunday mornings, spent reading the all of it, felt tainted now, corrupted by the knowledge of Amanda's betrayal. Had any of it been real, or had she been playing a part all along, waiting until she could find someone better? "Mr. Ramsey, we're finished here. Do you have any questions?" Mark blinked, looking down at the signed papers. It seemed surreal that 5 years of marriage could be dissolved so quickly, reduced to nothing more than a stack of legal documents. "Horse," he said, his voice calm. "No questions." He left the office, divorce papers tucked under his arm. It was time for her to face the consequences. Mark's jaw clenched as he stepped out onto the busy Seattle street. He was going to take control of his life again, starting with his career and ending with Amanda's fate. She had no idea what was coming over the next few weeks. He threw himself into his work with a fervor that surprised even his most ambitious colleagues. He arrived at the office before dawn and often stayed well past midnight, fueled by a potent mixture of caffeine and righteous anger. His boss noticed the change and praised his dedication, hinting at a possible promotion, but Mark barely registered the compliments. His mind was focused on a single goal: success, not just for himself, but as a form of revenge against Amanda. He would build the life she had thrown away and make it better than anything she could have imagined. When he was done, when he had climbed to the heights she could only dream of, she would understand exactly what she had lost. It turned into weeks, and Mark's pain began to harden into something colder and more calculated. He started gathering information and calling in favors from contacts in the industry. Amanda's arrest hadn't made the news yet, but Mark knew it was only a matter of time. He hired the best divorce attorney in the city and instructed them to be as aggressive as possible in the settlement negotiations. Amanda had destroyed their marriage, and he would make sure she walked away with nothing. Late one night, as Mark sat in his empty loft, reviewing case files, Mark sat in his empty loft, going over case files. His phone buzzed with a text from Amanda. "Can we talk?" He considered replying, but then he remembered her cold words at the police station. She'd dismissed their years together with a decisive swipe, He deleted the message and, after a moment's thought, blocked her number. There'd be no going back, no second chances. Amanda had made her bed. Now she'd have to lie in it. He turned back to his work, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. The path ahead was clear. He'd rebuild his life brick by brick, and make sure Amanda understood the full weight of her actions. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. While Mark focused on rebuilding his life, Amanda's world continued to crumble around her. The news of her arrest at first, the news was only in the police reports and courthouse whispers, but eventually, it made its way to the local media. The headlines were brutal, with her mugshot splashed across newspapers and websites. From the boardroom to the street corner, the fall of Amanda Ramsey was on full display. She's been sitting in her living room, curtains drawn against the prying eyes of neighbors and reporters. She's been scrolling through the endless stream of articles on her phone, feeling like each one was another nail in the coffin. Her company, the fashion brand she had worked so hard to climb the ranks of, wasted no time in distancing themselves from the scandal. The termination email arrived less than an hour after the first news report, citing her criminal charges as a breach of conduct. As she read the cold, impersonal words ending her employment, Amanda felt a wave of nausea wash over her. It wasn't just a job she had lost. It was her identity, her sense of self-worth, her entire future. The men she had been seeing, the ones who had made her feel alive and desired, suddenly vanished. When Mark's attention had waned, it was like he'd disappeared overnight. Texts went unanswered, calls went straight to voicemail. The thrill of illicit encounters was replaced by a crushing sense of loneliness. Her friends, who had once been so eager to share in her success, now avoided her calls. Social media became a minefield of judgment and mockery. Comments ranged from faux concern to outright cruelty, each one chipping away at her self-esteem. Amanda found herself drowning in a sea of legal fees and mounting debts as the days passed. The lavish lifestyle she had grown accustomed to, designer clothes, expensive dinners, regular spa treatments, became a distant memory. She was forced to sell her car and her jewelry just to keep the lights on and food in the fridge. Despite it all, she kept expecting Mark to reach out. Despite the betrayal, Amanda still believed Mark would come to her rescue. However, weeks turned into months with no word from him, slowly killing her hope. One particularly bleak evening, Amanda sat alone in her increasingly bare apartment, staring at an old photo of her and Mark. It had been taken on their honeymoon, with both of them smiling in the sun. They were kissing and laughing on a beach in Bali. They looked young in love and full of hope for the future. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized what she had lost. It wasn't just her job or her social status. It was the one person who had always been there for her. She had pushed him away in her reckless pursuit of. With a mix of excitement and validation, she picked up her phone and dialed Mark's number. It rang once, twice, and then 3 times before going to voicemail. His familiar voice, now tinged with an edge of coldness, filled her ear. "You reached Mark Ramsey. I'm not available right now. Please leave a message." Amanda opened her mouth, ready to apologize and plead for. She was on the verge of asking for forgiveness, but in the end, all that came out was a choked sob before she hung up. Curling up on the couch and hugging a pillow to her chest, Amanda realized the true cost of her actions. She had gambled everything, her marriage, her career, her reputation, and she had lost it all. Her life was gone, shattered beyond repair by her own selfish choices. Meanwhile, across town, Mark was in his office, working late as usual. He barely glanced at his phone when it buzzed with a block number, a silent reminder of the life he had left behind. Instead, he turned his attention to the woman sitting across from him. Harper Mitchell was a colleague he had known for years but never paid much attention to before. She was reviewing some reports with him. She had dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, dark eyes, and she seemed sharp and focused as she pointed out some discrepancies in the data. Her hair was tied back in a neat bun, and her green eyes were sharp and focused as she pointed out some discrepancies in the data. As she spoke, Mark noticed things he had overlooked before. The intelligence behind her eyes, the quiet confidence in her voice, and the way her presence seemed to calm the storm of emotions that had been raging inside him for months. "Mark, are you listening?" Harper's voice broke in. Through his thoughts, he heard a hint of amusement in her tone and realized he'd been staring, saying, "Sorry, I was just lost in thought." "You were saying?" Harper's smile was understanding. with a warmth that made something stir in Mark's chest. "I was saying that maybe we should call it a night. It's late and these numbers will still be here in the morning." Mark glanced at his watch, surprised to see it was well past. "Midnight, you're right. I'm sorry for keeping you so late." "Don't apologize," Harper said, gathering her things. "I'm happy to help. I know things have been tough for you lately. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here for you." Mark felt a rush of gratitude mixed with something else he couldn't quite identify. "Thank you, Harper." Leaving the office together, Mark felt a glimmer of something he hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't happiness, but it was close. It was hope for the first time since that night when his world had come crashing down. Mark allowed himself to imagine a future beyond the pain and betrayal. He imagined a future where he wasn't defined by Amanda's actions, but by his own strength and resilience. As he watched Harper drive away, waving goodbye with a warm smile, Mark realized that maybe, just maybe, there was light at the end of this long, dark tunnel. For the first time in months, he felt ready to move towards it. Mark Ramsey sat in his corner office, fingers steepled beneath his chin, as he gazed out at the Seattle skyline. 6 months had passed since that fateful night when his world had imploded. 6 months of anger, pain, and a slow-burning desire for revenge. He'd thrown himself into his work with a fervor that bordered on obsession. Late nights and weekends at the office had become his new normal. His colleagues whispered about his dedication, and his boss praised his results. But few understood the darkness that drove him. A soft knock at the door broke his wry Harper Mitchell, his closest confidant. Over the past few months, she'd been thinking of ways to help. She'd brought him a cup of coffee, which he gratefully accepted, setting it down on his desk. "You've been looking at that skyline for about an hour," she said, perching on the edge of his desk. "How are you holding up?" He nodded, his concern evident in his eyes. She'd been one of the few people who knew the full story of his ex. His wife's betrayal, she'd been his rock through the divorce, a steady presence when everything else in his life felt like shifting sand. He couldn't let it go. What she did, it can't just be forgotten. Harper's brow furrowed. "Mark, you've already won the divorce settlement. It's not enough." He cut her off. A heartache edged to his voice. "She destroyed everything we built. She needs to understand the consequences of her actions." Harper looked like she wanted to argue, but something in Mark's expression stopped her. Instead, she placed a gentle hand on his. "Just be careful, okay? Don't let this consume you." Mark nodded, but as Harper left the office, his mind was already churning with thoughts. He opened his laptop and started typing on his private messaging platform. Over the past few months, he'd built a network of contacts in various tech companies across Seattle. People who owed him favors, or who simply enjoyed being in the loop on the latest industry gossip. Now it was time to call in those chips. He crafted a carefully worded message hinting at Amanda's indiscretions. Without mentioning her arrest, he made it clear that hiring her would be risky. He knew it was wrong, but he was still tempted. He remembered Amanda's cold words in the police station interview room, though, and that stopped him. He watched from afar as Amanda tried to rebuild her life, but it didn't work. Every job application was rejected, and every networking event ended in awkward silences. And she was avoided by everyone. Her once spotless reputation, built over years of hard work, was ruined. The whispers followed her everywhere she went. Wasn't that the marketing exec who got caught? Mark told himself he felt nothing as he watched her struggle. But late at night, when the office was empty and he was alone with his thoughts, he couldn't quite shake the image of her tear-stained face in that police station. He tried to drown out those moments of doubt by throwing himself even harder into his work. The results were undeniable. His team's productivity. He landed some major contracts that had once seemed out of reach. His boss called him into the office one Friday afternoon, with a rare smile on the older man's face. "Mark, I don't know what's got into you these past few months, but whatever it is, keep it up. The board's impressed. There's talk of a VP position opening up soon, and your name's at the top of the list, Mark." He nodded, accepting the praise with a tight smile. Success tasted sweet, but it wasn't enough yet. That night, as he nursed a scotch in his still sparse apartment, Mark made a decision. Time to put the final pressure on. He reached for his phone and found the number he was looking for, the best divorce lawyer in Seattle, the one he'd hired to handle his split from Amanda. "Jim Ramsey, it's Mark. I need you to look over something for me. I want to make sure the divorce settlement is airtight. No loopholes, no room for interpretation. I want her left with nothing, Mark felt a cold sense of satisfaction settle over him. Amanda had gambled everything they had built together. He'd thrown it all away for a few moments of pleasure. Now she'd truly understand the cost of her actions. The next morning, as he drove to the office, Mark caught a glimpse of his reflection in the rearview mirror. He hardly recognized the man staring back at him. The easy smile and warm eyes that had once characterized his face were gone. They'd been replaced by a hard, unforgiving mask. He looked away, pushing down the flicker of unease. This was who he needed to be now. Strong, unyielding. The man Amanda had deemed not good enough was gone. In his place stood Amanda Ramsey, stared at the eviction notice taped to her apartment door, the words blurring together as tears filled her eyes. This was it. Rock bottom. The life she'd known, the success she'd worked so hard for, had crumbled to dust around her. Her hands were shaking as she unlocked the door and stepped into the apartment that had once been her sanctuary. Now it felt like a tomb filled with the ghosts of her past mistakes. She sank onto the couch and thought about how it had come to this. 6 months ago, she had been at the top of her game. She had a powerful career and a beautiful home. And she was married to a man who loved her. Now, though, she was jobless, penniless, and utterly alone. The phone on the coffee table caught her eye, and she picked it up, scrolling through her contacts. The names that had once represented friendship, connection, and opportunity now mocked her. Every call for help had gone unanswered, and every plea for a second chance had been met with cold silence. Her finger hovered over Mark's name. She hadn't spoken to him since that day in the police station when the full weight of her betrayal had come crashing down. The memory of his face twisted with hurt and anger still haunted her. She had dreams, but she was out of options and out of time. With trembling fingers, she pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Her heart raced with each unanswered ring. Just as she was about to give up hope, there was a click, and hello, Mark's voice, once so familiar and comforting, sounded. Amanda could hear Mark's voice, distant and cold. She felt a mix of relief and fear. There was a long pause. Amanda thought he might hang up, but he finally spoke. His voice was neutral. "What do you want, Amanda?" "Everything, my job, my apartment. I don't know what to do. I know I have no right to ask, but you're the only person I have left." Another pause, this one stretching so long. "Amanda, I'm really sorry," but I think the call had dropped when Mark spoke again. His voice was tight with barely contained emotion. "Meet me at the diner on 5th. In an hour, don't be late." The line went dead before Amanda could respond. She stared at the phone, a mixture of hope and dread churning in her stomach. It wasn't much, but it was a lifeline, a chance. An hour later, Amanda sat in a booth at the back of the diner, nervously shredding a paper napkin. Above the door, the chime sounded, and she looked up to see Mark walk in. The easy warmth she remembered was replaced by coldness and a lack of warmth. He slid into the booth across from her, his face an unreadable mask. "Thank you for coming," Amanda said softly, finding the urge to reach for his hand. Her breath caught in her throat. He looked different, harder somehow. "I didn't think you would." Mark's eyes met hers and she flinched at the coldness she saw there. "Amanda, I have a meeting in 30 minutes. She swallowed hard, forcing down the lump in her throat. Mark's expression didn't change. Amanda blinked back tears. "No, that's not all. I've been evicted from my apartment. I can't find work anywhere, and I'm drowning in legal issues. I don't know what to do." She reached into her purse and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. "This is the address of the motel I'm staying at. It's the best I can do at the moment, please, Mark. I know I don't deserve it, but if you could just help me out this one time." Mark took the paper. His eyes scanned the address for a moment, and something like pity flickered across his face. But as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by that same cold mask. "You're right," he said. His voice was low and hard. "You don't deserve my help. You didn't think twice about destroying our marriage, Amanda. You let strangers touch you without thinking about the consequences. Do you even care about the life you were throwing away?" Amanda flinched as if he'd slapped her. "Mark, please." He cut her off. His words were sharp as knives. "This is your life now, Amanda. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them. You'll have to live with the consequences." He stood up, towering over her for a moment. Amanda saw a brief flash of the man she'd married, kind, compassionate, always ready to help, But then it was gone, replaced by this cold stranger wearing her husband's face. "Goodbye, Amanda," he said, turning to leave. "Don't contact me again." As the diner door swung shut behind him, Amanda buried her face in her hands. She buried her face in her hands and shook her shoulders with silent sobs. She'd gambled everything on this meeting, on the hope that some small part of the man she'd loved still existed. Now that hope was gone, she was truly alone. Outside, Mark strode to his car. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. He told himself the tightness in his chest was satisfaction, not regret. The image of Amanda's broken expression didn't bother him as he got into his car. He'd just sent Harper a text. How did it go? He stared at the message for a long moment before replying. It's done. She won't bother us again. Was this justice? He told himself this was what Amanda deserved as he pulled away from the curb. Mark didn't look back at the diner. If he had, he might have seen Amanda stumble out onto the sidewalk, lost and alone in a world that no longer had a place for her. But he didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. The man who might have felt compassion for his ex-wife was gone. Amanda's situation was no longer on his mind. He was replaced by someone who was harder, colder, and who would never be hurt again. Scene 3. The final twist. The courtroom was filled with low murmurs as Mark took his seat at the back. He hadn't planned on being there that day, but something had drawn him in. Perhaps it was a need for closure, or maybe just morbid curiosity. Amanda sat at the defendant's table. Her once immaculate appearance was now a shadow of its former self. Her hair was limp around her face, and her designer clothes were replaced by a simple blouse and skirt that had seen better days. She looked small and defeated. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Mark watched as the proceedings unfolded. He faced an impassive mask. The charges were read out, and it was revealed that she had repeatedly solicited, which was a violation of her probation from the first arrest. Amanda's lawyer, a public defender who looked barely out of law school, made a half-hearted plea for leniency. Mark knew it was hopeless. He'd made sure of it. The judge's voice was stern as he delivered the sentence. Miss Ramsey, given your repeated offenses and violation of probation, this court sentences you to 18 months in state prison. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Amanda's shoulders slumped, her head bowed under the weight of, as the bailiff approached to take her into custody. She looked up and scanned the crowd for a moment. Her gaze locked with Mark's, and he saw a flicker of recognition, followed by a wave of emotions too complex to name. They all swirled in her eyes, a silent plea that Mark refused to acknowledge. He watched, stone-faced. The bailiff handcuffed Amanda, and the cold metal placed around her wrists echoed through the room. It was the same way she'd been led away that night, months ago, when Mark's world first shattered. As Amanda was led out of the courtroom, she glanced back one last time, taking in her last glimpse of. Amanda was led away, and Mark stood watching her with a cold detachment. The courtroom doors closed behind her, and Mark remained seated as the room emptied around him. He thought that watching Amanda face the consequences of her actions would bring him satisfaction and closure. He felt nothing but a vast, echoing emptiness where his anger had once burned. He walked out of the courthouse, slowly straightening his tie, and felt a strange sense of lightness. The weight of betrayal and revenge that had driven him for so long seemed to lift with each step. Outside, the Seattle sky was a brilliant blue, and the air was crisp with the promise of autumn. Mark took a deep breath, feeling as if he was waking from a long, dark dream. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Harper. How did it go? Mark stared at the message for a long moment before replying. It's done. Time to move forward. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Mark realized that something had changed inside him. The cold, vengeful man who had driven Amanda to ruin was receding, like ice melting in the spring sun. In his place stood someone new, someone who had faced betrayal and come out stronger, someone who had found a new purpose and direction. He thought if Harper had shown him warmth and understanding over the past few months, and they'd even had some late-night strategy sessions that had slowly evolved into something more. Maybe there was room in his life for hope again. Mark squared his shoulders and began walking toward his car, with the courthouse looming in the background. The past he was leaving behind was uncertain, but also full of possibilities. He had regained control of his life. He had faced betrayal and humiliation, but in the end, he had risen stronger than ever. As a man began her sentence behind bars, Mark stood tall, ready to embrace whatever came next. The man who had once been the man defined by his marriage to Amanda's betrayal was gone. In his place stood someone new, someone victorious. Mark Ramsey had won in every sense of the word as he drove away from the courthouse. He allowed himself a small smile. The future stretched out before him, bright with promise. He was ready to seize it with both hands,